wasn't sure if I was going to do a follow-up on this story, but I think it's worth doing because it's not going away. Keir Starmer has come out and criticised Sunak for being weak because Sunak will not say that Lee Anderson is an Islamophobe. Now, senior Tories have all condemned Anderson. They've said that his comments were unacceptable, and he's obviously lost the whip. He's been suspended, so he has been punished for telling the truth about this ideology. I think that is appalling. I think the reason that this has happened is because the Tories, rightly or wrongly, they see this as a political move to deflect Labour's criticism. I think there's party politics involved. Labour has long been accused of anti-Semitism, so I honestly think that Labour will be, they were itching for a chance to say, oh, but look, the Tories are also bigoted. But it's very, very important we understand what's going on here, and why I do think that there are differences between charges of anti-Semitism in Labour and charges of Islamophobia against the Tories. So if you have a left-leaning person in Labour ranks who's criticising the state of Israel, I do not believe that is evidence of anti-Semitism in of itself. There are Tories who've criticised Israel. There's Conservatives who've criticised Israel. I do not think that criticising a nation state is the same as bigotry, and there must be the freedom to be allowed to do that. Now, it becomes anti-Semitic when it gets into anti-Semitic tropes, for example, about media control. For one thing, it's inaccurate because there has been extensive coverage of the suffering in Gaza, as there should be. Um, and I don't agree that the media is just blindly supportive of Israel. I think there has been criticism of Israel's um, policies on this. So to get into this argument about Jewish media control is an anti-Semitic trope, and it has a long history of that. But if criticizing Israel is attacked as anti-Semitism, that's misplaced. But I don't think that's happening. Um, the Labour candidate who recently got into trouble for this, he wasn't attacking Israel. He was talking about basically Zionist media control. Now, you might argue Zionism is an ideology in the same way that Islamism is. It's a bit more specific because Zionism is specifically a belief in a Jewish homeland, whereas Islamism is more pan in scope. It's a global movement. It's a global ideology. Now, I think that there is a thin line between criticizing Zionism and outright anti-Semitism. But even criticizing Zionism, I wouldn't outlaw that or say that it's evidence of hating Jewish people. But I do think it's skirting close to that red line of crossing that, into anti-Semitic tropes. I also question those who fixate on Israel whilst turning a blind eye to other states in the region. And I do think that there is a question about why Israel is always singled out by these people. I mean, the same people, damning Israel right now didn't have much to say when Bashar Assad was killing Syrian children. This is not to say that I agree with everything Israel's doing. I have said I'm uncomfortable with the situation in Gaza. It's clearly a horrible situation, and I do think Israel's going too far. I don't think there's any moral justification for bombing hospitals, even if there is Hamas fighters in them. It's There's certain things that just should not be done, and I think that's one of them. So I will support the right to criticize Israel. Um, but the thing about the charges of Islamophobia in Tory ranks is we're not talking about Tory MPs expressing hatred of Muslims or expressing conspiracies about Muslim media control or spouting out lines about all Muslims. So that brings me to the Lee Anderson controversy. He clearly stated Islamists. He did not say Muslims. This is a key difference. Um, This was yesterday's Daily Express. Getting back, Tories rally around race Lee Anderson. I'm going to put a link in this video to an interview he gave on GB News after he was sacked. Of course, he made the statement saying that he understood they had no choice. What's notable is senior Tories have criticised him, people like Mark Harper, Oliver Dowden, and the Prime Minister. And some are saying there's no route back for him unless he does a complete mea culpa and basically says he's a racist. But, or rather, not he's a racist, but what he said is racist. I think this would be a very big mistake, and I think it's disgraceful that those Tories are basically throwing him under the bus. This is a very dangerous thing where we're conflating racism, that is bigotry against an ethnic minority group, with legitimate criticism of an ideology, Islamism. Now, London specifically, and the country as a whole, has suffered from this ideology. Hundreds have been killed and injured, literally, including the injured. The victims go into the hundreds. Let's look at 2005, 52 killed in London. 2017, 22 killed in Manchester, 6 killed in London, 8 killed in London in numerous attacks, 2 killed in 2019 in London, the Fishmongers Hall attack, 3 killed in Reading. That isn't including the attempted attacks at Exeter, Glasgow, and elsewhere, plus lone wolf attacks or attacks with single victims, such as Lee Rigby and Sir David Amess. Um, Islamism has cost lives in this country. It's the single biggest threat to this country in terms of anti terror. And yes, there's a problem with the far right, but the simple reality is they have not killed anywhere near as many people. There's been a few incidents of hate crimes where people were killed, such as Joe Cox, and there was an elderly Muslim man who was killed in Birmingham at the same time as Lee Rigby, actually. But so far, we haven't seen a mass atrocity um, in the same period from the far right. So I don't believe it's on the same scale. I think both are a problem, but I don't believe it's on the same scale. Um, what infuriates me, absolutely infuriates me about this, is those reactionary fools who are jumping on this and saying it proves racism in the Tory ranks. And there's no one putting an onus on them to say, wait a second, where is the racism? You know, Good Morning Britain was just churning this out. Like, is this evidence of racism in the Tory party? That's not verbatim, but it's the line that they were taking. Um, I'm disgusted. I'm really disgusted. And whilst I'm pleased that Tory ministers are not saying that it's Islamophobic, I'm pleased they're not using that word. Nevertheless, I do think they've thrown him under the bus. The reality is, many people support Mr. Anderson. I know that from comment threads, and I know that's not an exact barometer, but also on social media, people have been going to his page to support him. I've seen very few critical comments there. So, whilst that is not concrete, as you know, I think it's some sort of indicator of where public opinion is. Of course, people on the left will, you know, he's a Tory and he said something controversial, so he must be a racist. Let's just, not bother looking at the facts. Specifically, he was calling out Sadiq Khan and Keir Starmer as being controlled by Islamists. Now, that may be a clumsy thing to say, to basically accuse rival politicians of being controlled by Islamists. Khan and Starmer would have a right to defend themselves from that claim, but what he was talking about was very much in the context of the pro Palestinian rallies recently, would have unquestionably been Hamas sympathisers, where only last week it was beamed onto the Houses of Parliament, our symbol for democracy, from the river to the sea, which is widely considered a message of eliminating the state of Israel, because by definition, that's what it would mean. From the River Jordan, to the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, that's wipe out the state of Israel. So it is implicitly, if not an anti Jewish statement, it's an anti Israel statement, anti Israeli statement. Now, why does that get a free pass? The Metropolitan Police, I'm aware that the resources are stretched. I'm aware that this is a problem because as they're policing these rallies, it's taking them away from other crimes. So there is a genuine resource problem there. But I also think the Met is not blameless, and Lee Anderson also criticised them. They're not blameless because they have not been consistent. They have told Jewish people to take down missing posters for the kidnapped in Gaza, um, ostensibly for their own safety, but nevertheless, that's what they told them to do. When you had Islamists calling for jihad, the Metropolitan Police's useless response was, "We'll look into it." Yet, if anyone shows a UK or England flag, you can be damn sure the police will swoop in and move them on or even arrest them. There is a very, very serious problem here with what they're prioritising. Now, I appreciate that the police can just go out and arrest thousands of people at a pro Palestinian rally, and I'm not even saying they should. But you cannot have a minority that is constantly taking the capital hostage, whether it be eco zealots or whether it be pro Palestinians, making the same protest over and over and over again for the same cause. Um, yes, there's a right to dissent. Yes, there's a right to protest. But I think unquestionably there are terrorist sympathizers among them. I'm not going to say all of them, that would be wrong. But unquestionably, there are Hamas sympathizers among them. And I think the Met have been weak. I think they've been inconsistent. Yet, what is the story? Lee Anderson, the racist. You know, I'm disgusted actually by the Moral Minnows attacking this man. And when it comes to the general election, I'll remember stuff like this, and I'll remember Keir Starmer's position. I mean, one of my biggest concerns about Labour, going beyond this story, is the possibility that they'll introduce some sort of legislation. Goodness knows what name it will get formally, but ostensibly it will be, anti-hate legislation, for example, to tackle Islamophobia. But what it will actually amount to is a blasphemy law. Because if you get into a situation where you're conflating hatred of a people, i.e., Muslims, versus legitimate criticism of an ideology, i.e., Islamism, or even Islam as a faith, Islamic dogma, for example, that's an incredibly dangerous conflation because that's when you start getting into territory not only of censorship, but de facto blasphemy laws. So if Labour were to pass such legislation, we would effectively have blasphemy laws whereby you cannot criticize Islam. That might sound exaggerated. I'm not sure that it is. When you consider the trajectory that Labour is going on, when you consider that they weaponize this contentious term of Islamophobia, incidentally, the Conservative Party's official position is to describe anti Muslim hatred. That's something I agree with because I think Islamophobia has been weaponized to silence legitimate criticism of Islamic dogma and Islamism. These are incredibly important issues, and I think that Starmer once again shows he's a politically correct card. Now, I want to believe in Starmer. I want to think of, well, he might be a change. I certainly am not a natural Tory voter. I think they have been in power now for a generation. There's a lot of, they seem tired, they seem out of touch in many ways. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think a lot of the people supporting Lee Anderson will go to the Reform Party. I'm certainly not at a point to do that because I would want to know what's their position on, well, a lot of issues. Ukraine, are they pro-Trump, etc. So I'm certainly not in a rush to do that. But I feel somewhat politically homeless. I want to believe in Labour. I want to, because believe it or not, there's still parts of me that is ideologically left wing, but I'm disgusted by Starmer's capitalising on this. Yeah, I suppose he was named by Anderson, so he's a right to defend himself. But him and Sadiq Khan, their record on Islamism is weak, unquestionably weak. And whilst I give Starmer credit for acting quickly on the anti-Semitism thing, certainly compared to Corbyn, the fact of the matter is there are Labour people and left-leaning woke activists who refuse to call this thing by name, Islamism. Yet you could be damn sure when it comes to calling out the far right, they're vocal and they will call it by name. They'll call it white supremacists, they'll call it far right. They will name that. But when it comes to Islamist extremism, they refuse to call it by name. So I call on all elected politicians, have some backbone, call Islamism for what it is, and don't attack other elected politicians for telling the truth about this. The only thing I would say about Anderson's thing was the statement, Khan and Starmer are controlled by Islamists. He didn't say they were personally Islamists. He didn't actually say Sadiq Khan was an Islamist. He said he's controlled by Islamists. What he was referring to, it was frustration from what he sees. It was a little bit clumsy. It was a little bit undiplomatic. Is it wrong? I mean, has Sadiq Khan really done enough with this problem? The irony is Sadiq Khan himself has been threatened by Islamists. So he, of all people, should know something about that. He, of all people, should not be weaponizing this term Islamophobia because he himself, as an elected Muslim, high profile Muslim, has been threatened by Islamists. That's the irony here. Yet he is lapping up this Islamophobia charge against Lee Anderson. Well, just so it's clear where I stand, I'm 100% with Lee Anderson. I'm going to put a link to the GB News interview, and I'm disgusted by those moral minnows who are lining up to vilify this man, but they don't have a damn thing to say about the hateful, anti Semitic, misogynistic, homophobic, anti West bile that comes from Islamists, not to mention the hatred they espouse against apostates and ex Muslims. Um, it's a mindset that has no place on this island. Um, Anderson wasn't attacking Muslims, he wasn't attacking a race, he was attacking an ideology. And that must be repeated over and over again because there's people out there who are distorting this. And Yasmin Alibi Brown, I have lost any respect I might have once had for her. She's actually one of the co-founders of a group called the British Muslims for Secular Democracy. I used to be a member of that group because I felt they were a moderate group taking on extremists. But at some point, they started to be hijacked by left wing thinking and they split. There's now a group called the British and Global Muslims for Secular Democracy, which I'm a member of. But regardless, Yasmin Alibi Brown has just become a reactionary woke leftist. She herself has been accused of anti white racism. If you're wondering who I'm talking about, she's a commentator, a columnist in the Eye. Yeah. Um, but everyone with integrity and honesty needs to see this for what it is. I probably wouldn't agree with Lee Anderson in everything. He's a conservative. I'm sure there'll be other areas, maybe welfare, for example, that I would disagree with him on. And I will always state my mind. But on issues like this, people have to have integrity and they have to stand up for the truth. And if that means being smeared as a racist, then that's very unfortunate. But, we have to push back against these cards, absolute cards, who would try and silence legitimate criticism of such ideologies by claiming it's racist. Shame on you, Keir Starmer, and shame on everyone else who's, jumping on this. Shame on senior Tories as well for throwing this man under the bus. Whether he's going to be reinstated or not, I don't know. I know he's very popular in Tory rank and file, but the problem is Sunak's kind of dug himself into a hole here because if he's now reinstated, then that will just give ammo to Labour to say that Sunak's weak. And if he isn't reinstated, then he's accused of, being Islamophobic. Or excuse me, if he isn't reinstated, then it angers red wall base voters. Um, but I think what senior Tories need to do is, firstly, they're doing this typical thing of not answering questions. I think they should answer questions. I think they should say, actually, he's not Islamophobic. He raised a legitimate concern about Islamist extremism. But these Tories who are they've put themselves in this position of refusing to say he's Islamophobic, and yet they're condemning him and saying, yes, it was racist. So they're just playing to the zeitgeist of so-called progressive thinking. Um, the whole thing infuriates me because I think that this man is being vilified unfairly simply for telling the truth. I mean, his criticism of Khan and the Metropolitan Police is absolutely valid in this regard. And as for one last thing, the police's resources, that is an issue. Um, but that doesn't explain the lack of priorities. I mean, I appreciate if they're policing pro-Palestinian rallies, that might explain why they're late to a burglary. What it doesn't explain is why they harass a gospel singer and say that she cannot, do what she's doing. I think there's a fundamental flaw in policing at the moment, and that's a major issue. Sadiq Khan, as Mayor of London, is responsible for policing policies along with the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. So actually, he does bear responsibility for this, a good bit of it. I don't blame Khan for every single thing that goes wrong in London, but a good bit of it. I mean, Mayor of London's is quite a significant position. It's quite a powerful position, and I think Khan is the worst Mayor of London, worse than Livingston, worse than Johnson. So yeah, I absolutely stand by Lee Anderson, and everyone with integrity and honesty should. And to those reactionary fools who are calling him a racist, you know, take away your partisan nonsense and look at this objectively. Just look at it objectively. Forget that he's a conservative for a second and actually think about what he said.